By the 2nd century BCE, a displaced nomadic confederation began a migration that would reshape the political landscape of Central Asia. The origins of the Yuezhi are first documented in the historical records of early imperial China, particularly in the Shurji compiled by Sima Qian during the 1st century BCE. According to these accounts, the Yuezhi occupied the Gansu Corridor, a narrow and strategically significant region in northwestern China that connected the Central Plains to the Western territories. This corridor functioned as a conduit for trade, migration, and military movement, making it a contested frontier between sedentary Chinese states and nomadic steppe groups. Archaeological evidence from this region indicates the presence of mobile pastoralist communities, characterized by horse-based economies and burial practices consistent with steppe traditions. Chinese records describe the Yuezhi as a powerful tribal confederation during the 3rd century BCE, engaged in regional competition with neighboring groups. Their political structure appears to have been decentralized, consisting of multiple clans under loosely coordinated leadership. This form of organization allowed for flexibility in movement and warfare, but also limited the capacity for unified resistance against larger, more centralized forces. The stability of their position in the Gansu corridor was disrupted in the late 3rd to early 2nd century BCE, when the rise of the Xiongnu introduced a new phase of conflict across the steppe. According to the Shurji, the Yuezhi suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of the Xiongnu around 176 BCE. The accounts describe the killing of the Yuezhi leader and the subsequent use of his skull as a ceremonial drinking vessel by the Xiongnu ruler, an act recorded to emphasize the scale of the defeat. While the narrative reflects the perspective of Han chroniclers, it aligns with broader patterns of steppe warfare, where dominance was often demonstrated through symbolic acts. This defeat marked a turning point, forcing the Yuezhi to abandon their established territory and initiate a large-scale westward migration. The migration of the Yuezhi proceeded in stages, as recorded in Han diplomatic reports and later historical compilations. Initially, the confederation moved into the Ili River Valley, displacing or absorbing local populations. This movement triggered a chain reaction among steppe groups, contributing to wider instability across Central Asia. Archaeologists have identified material culture shifts in this region during the 2nd century BCE, including changes in burial styles and artifacts, which are consistent with the arrival of new populations. These findings support the textual accounts of large-scale population movements during this period. The Yuezhi did not remain in the Ili region permanently. Continued pressure from the Xiongnu and conflicts with other nomadic groups, including the Wusun, led to further displacement. Chinese sources indicate that the Yuezhi divided into 2 main groups during this phase: the Lesser Yuezhi, who remained in areas closer to China, and the Greater Yuezhi, who continued their migration westward. It is the Greater Yuezhi who are directly associated with the later formation of the Kushan Empire. Their movement carried them across the Oxus River into the region historically known as Bactria. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Greater Yuezhi had entered Bactria, a region that had previously been part of the Hellenistic world following the conquests of Alexander the Great. After the decline of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, Bactria was characterized by a mixture of urban centers, agricultural settlements, and residual Hellenistic cultural elements. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Ai Khanum reveal Greek-style architecture, inscriptions, and coinage, indicating the persistence of Hellenistic influence even after political fragmentation. Chinese envoy reports, particularly those of Zhang Qian in the 2nd century BCE, provide direct observations of the Yuezhi in Bactria. Zhang Qian described them as having adopted a more sedentary lifestyle compared to their earlier nomadic existence. They occupied fertile lands, engaged in agriculture, and controlled established urban centers. These accounts are corroborated by archaeological evidence showing continuity in settlement patterns alongside the introduction of steppe-associated artifacts. The integration of the Yuezhi into Bactrian society did not involve the complete replacement of existing populations, but rather a process of political domination combined with cultural adaptation. Numismatic evidence from this period further illustrates the transition. Coins issued in Bactria during the post-Greek period retain Hellenistic motifs, including Greek inscriptions and iconography, while gradually incorporating new elements associated with incoming groups. This suggests that the Yuezhi adopted existing economic systems rather than replacing them entirely. The use of coinage indicates participation in regional trade networks, which connected Central Asia to both the Indian subcontinent and the Iranian plateau. The settlement of the Yuezhi in Bactria represents a significant shift in their socio-political organization. While they retained elements of their tribal structure, the control of urban centers and agricultural land required new forms of governance. Chinese sources refer to the division of the Yuezhi into 5 principalities, each ruled by a chieftain. This arrangement reflects a transitional phase between a nomadic confederation and a more centralized state. The distribution of power among multiple leaders allowed for regional control while maintaining a broader collective identity. Archaeological surveys in northern Afghanistan and southern Uzbekistan have identified settlement expansions and changes in material culture dating to this period. Pottery styles, burial practices, and fortification structures indicate both continuity and adaptation. The presence of fortified sites suggests the need to secure territory and manage resources, particularly in a region with established urban infrastructure. These developments point to an increasing level of political organization and territorial stability. The integration of the Yuezhi into the Bactrian environment also positioned them within existing trade networks. Bactria had long served as a crossroads between East and West, linking the Iranian plateau, the Indian subcontinent, and the steppe regions. Control of this provided access to goods, resources, and strategic routes. Chinese records note the relative wealth of the region, describing markets, agricultural production, and trade activity. The Yuezhi's presence in Bactria therefore had economic as well as political implications. By the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE, the Yuezhi had established a stable presence in Bactria, maintaining control over Kemenarthica and integrating into the regional economy. Their political structure remained decentralized, but the conditions for further consolidation were in place. The combination of steppe mobility, access to agricultural resources, and exposure to Hellenistic administrative practices created a foundation for future state formation. As the Yuezhi consolidated their presence in Bactria, internal political organization began to evolve into more structured leadership. In the 1st century CE, a single ruler unified fragmented tribes into a political entity that would dominate transcontinental trade. By the beginning of the 1st century CE, the Yuezhi Confederation in Bactria had maintained regional stability for several generations. Yet its internal political structure remained divided among 5 Bermukh principalities. Chinese historical sources, particularly the Ho Hanshu, describe these divisions and identify one of them, the Guishuang, as the Samuh that would eventually rise to dominance. The transition from a loose confederation to a centralized polity occurred gradually, shaped by competition among these tribal Natao, and the strategic advantages offered by control over trade routes and settled al-Arathi. The consolidation of power is associated with the leadership of Kujala Kadphises, who is identified in both Chinese texts and numismatic evidence as the figure responsible for unifying the Yuezhi tribes. According to the Ho Hanshu, Kujala Kadphises, referred to as Kujiuk in Chinese transcription, subdued the other Yuezhi chieftains and established himself as the sole ruler. While the exact sequence of campaigns is not preserved in detail, the outcome is spushed. The Panch Rajnitik units were brought under a single authority, marking the end of the earlier confederative system. This unification represented a structural shift in governance. The earlier Yuezhi system had been based on distributed power, with each tribal leader exercising autonomy within their kshetra. Under Kujala Kadphises, authority became centralized, with the ruler exercising control over military, arctic, and diplomatic functions. This Parivartan enabled more coordinated decision-making, particularly in relation to territorial expansion and control of trade networks. The emergence of a single ruling figure also allowed for the development of dynastic legitimacy, which would become a defining feature of Kushan. Numismatic evidence provides critical insight into this transitional phase. Coins attributed to Kujala Kadphises display a combination of Greek and local elements, reflecting the istimraran of Hellenistic traditions in Bactria. Many of these coins imitate earlier issues of Indo-Greek rulers, particularly those of Hermias, whose authority had previously extended into parts of the region. The use of Greek script and iconography indicates not only economic continuity but also an muhawala to legitimize authority through association with established political traditions. Over time, these coins begin to incorporate new inscriptions, including the name of Kujala Kadphises, signaling the assertion of independent rule. Archaeological findings support this interpretation. Coin hoards discovered in northern Afghanistan and Pakistan show a gradual transition from Indo-Greek to Kushan coinage, rather than an abrupt replacement. This suggests that the consolidation of power involved the absorption of existing administrative anarchic systems rather than their elimination. The continued use of Greek language on coinage also reflects the linguistic diversity of the region and the need to communicate authority across different populations engaged in trade and governance. The expansion of Kujala Kadphises' authority extended beyond the Hududin of Bactria. Historical and numismatic evidence indicates that he moved into territories formerly controlled by Indo-Scythian and Indo-Greek rulers, particularly in the regions of Kabul, Gandhara, and the northwestern Indian subcontinent. These kshetrong were strategically significant due to their position along major trade routes connecting Central Asia with the Indian plains. A saithara over these monarchica allowed the emerging Kushan polity to integrate multiple Arctic zones, linking Krishi Utpadan kshetrong with long-distance vyapar networks. The process of territorial expansion appears to have been incremental. Rather than a single abhiyan, it likely involved a series of military karavayon and rajnitic alliances. The absence of detailed narratives in surviving sources limits precise reconstruction, but the nataija are evident in the distribution of Kushan coinage and the decline of competing political entities in the region. By the end of Kujala Kadphises' reign, the Kushan polity controlled a continuous kshetral mumteddu from Bactria into northwestern India. The integration of these territories required administrative adaptation. The populations of Gandhara and adjacent regions were culturally and linguistically distinct from those of Bactria, with strong influences from Indian religious and Samajik systems. Evidence from inscriptions and material culture indicates that the Kushans adopted a policy of prashasnik flexibility, allowing local practices to continue while establishing overarching political authority. This approach facilitated stability and reduced resistance, particularly in Monarthiku with established urban centers and religious institutions. Religious diversity during this period is also reflected in the available evidence. While direct inscriptions from Kujala Kadphises are limited, later Kushan coinage and archaeological findings suggest the presence of multiple Armic traditions, including local cults, Hellenistic deities, and early forms of Buddhism. The absence of a single imposed Dharmic system indicates that political consolidation did not rely on ideological uniformity, but rather on control of resources and strategic territories. Trade played a central role in reinforcing the authority of the unified polity. A saithara over key routes connecting Central Asia to the Indian subcontinent allowed the Kushans to regulate the movement of goods, such as textiles, metals, and krishi products. Coinage facilitated these exchanges, providing a standardized medium of value across regions. The economic benefits of trade likely contributed to the stability of Kujala Kadphises' rule, enabling the samurtan of military forces and administrative structures. Chinese sources further note that the unified Yuezhi, now increasingly referred to as Kushans, engaged in diplomatic contacts with neighboring powers. These interactions indicate recognition of their Rajnitic status and integration into broader regional networks. The consolidation of Asulta under Kujala Kadphises thus positioned the Kushans as a Pramukh Shakti in Central Asia, capable of influencing both Attajara and diplomacy. By the end of the 1st century CE, the transformation from a fragmented tribal confederation to a centralized polity was effectively complete. The foundations of Kushanshasan, centralized leadership, territorial continuity, economic integration, and administrative adaptability, had been established. These developments created the structural conditions necessary for Dalneshri expansion and the eventual emergence of a full imperial system under subsequent rulers. With political unity established, the Kushans began to expand territorially into South Asia. As Kushan armies crossed into the Indian subcontinent, they secured control over one of the most vital crossroads of ancient trade. Following the political consolidation achieved under Kujala Kadphises, the Kushan polity entered a phase of sustained territorial expansion during the late 1st century CE. This process is most closely associated with his successor, Vima-Kadphises, whose reign is documented primarily through numismatic and archaeological evidence. While literary sources remain limited, coin distributions and site excavations provide a consistent picture of gradual southward and southeastward expansion into the Indian subcontinent. This al-Marhala marked a decisive shift from regional Shakti in Bactria to a trans-regional empire linking Central Asia with northern India. The region of Gandhara emerged as the primary niktha of entry and consolidation. Located along the upper Indus Basin, Gandhara occupied a strategically critical position between Central Asia and the Indian plains. Archaeological sites such as Taxila reveal a long history of urban settlement, trade activity, and cultural exchange. Excavations at Taxila have uncovered layers corresponding to Achaemenid, Hellenistic, Indo-Greek, and Indo-Scythian phases, indicating the Elminthaka's continuity as a center of Rajnitic and Arctic activity. By the time of Kushan expansion, Gandhara represented both an Arctic opportunity and a logistical gateway into the subcontinent. Numismatic evidence provides one of the clearest indicators of Kushan presence in the region. Coins attributed to Vima-Kadphises have been discovered across a wide geographical nithakan, including areas of present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. These coins exhibit a significant development: the introduction of large-scale gold coinage. Unlike earlier silver and copper issues, gold coins indicate access to substantial wealth and participation in long-distance trade networks. The iconography on these coins often combines Greek script with images of deities drawn from Iranian and Indian traditions, reflecting a continuation of the syncretic cultural patterns established in Bactria. Records indicate that the expansion into Gandhara was not a single Sena Abhiyan but rather a series of coordinated movements that combined military quwwa with political integration. The decline of Indo-Greek and Indo-Scythian polities in the region created a fragmented political landscape, which facilitated Kushan advancement. Rather than encountering a unified resistance, Kushan forces were able to incorporate these territories incrementally. The distribution of coinage suggests that control was established first in urban centers and trade hubs, before extending into surrounding Manathaka. The Indus River system played a central role in shaping the Disha and Gati of expansion. This Nadi network provided both a Prakritic corridor for movement and a mustaran of agricultural productivity. A Saithara over the Indus Basin allowed the Kushans to access fertile lands and established irrigation systems, which supported population growth and economic stability. Archaeological surveys in the region have identified settlement continuity alongside the introduction of Kushan material culture, indicating that existing communities were incorporated into the expanding political framework rather than displaced. The integration of northern India into the Kushan polity also had significant Arctic implications. By controlling Gandhara and the Indus region, the Kushans effectively linked the overland trade routes of Central Asia with the maritime Tijara networks of the Indian Ocean. Goods such as textiles, spices, precious stones, and metals moved through these interconnected systems. Roman artifacts, including coins and glassware found in Indian archaeological contexts, demonstrate the extent of these connections. The Kushans functioned as intermediaries, facilitating the movement of goods between the Roman Empire, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Coinage under Vima-Kadphises further reflects this Arctic integration. In addition to gold issues, copper and bronze coins continued to circulate, supporting everyday transactions in Stania markets. The use of standardized weights and inscriptions indicates a Viksit monetary system capable of operating across diverse regions. The presence of Greek script alongside emerging Bactrian and Prakrit elements suggests that the Kushans maintained linguistic adaptability in their Prashasnik practices, ensuring effective communication across different cultural zones. Cultural assimilation accelerated during this phase of expansion. The regions incorporated into the Kushan Empire were characterized by diverse Armic and Samajic traditions, including early Hindu practices, Buddhism, and residual Hellenistic cults. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of religious structures, such as stupas and temples, coexisting within the same urban environments. This coexistence indicates that the Kushans did not impose a singular ideological framework, but instead allowed multiple traditions to persist under their rule. This needy of accommodation contributed to Rajnitic stability and facilitated integration across newly acquired territories. Material culture from Gandhara during this period demonstrates a synthesis of artistic traditions. Sculptures and architectural elements exhibit Hellenistic stylistic features combined with Indian themes, particularly in the representation of religious figures. These developments are evident in the early stages of Gandharan art, which would later reach its peak under subsequent Kushan rulers. The presence of such hybrid forms reflects the broader process of cultural interaction enabled by Kushan expansion. The consolidation of Kushan authority in northern India required the establishment of administrative mechanisms capable of managing diverse populations and artic systems. While direct inscriptions from Vima Kadphises remain limited, later evidence suggests that provincial governance structures were implemented to oversee taxation, trade, and local administration. This Tamraran of urban centers such as Taxila indicates that existing infrastructures were maintained and integrated into the imperial framework. Chinese historical references, although indirect, suggest that the Kushans, identified as the Guishuang, continued to engage in diplomatic and commercial interactions with the Han Empire. These connections further reinforced the Aumika of the Kushan state as a mediator between East and West. The expansion into the Indian subcontinent therefore not only increased territorial extent, but also enhanced the empire's strategic position within Eurasian networks. By the early 2nd century CE, the Kushans had established control over a Vyapak Kshetra extending from Bactria through Gandhara into northern India. This expansion created a continuous Rajnitic and Arctic zone that linked multiple regions and cultures. The integration of these territories marked a Nirnayak stage in the development of the Kushan Empire, transforming it into a Pramukh Shakti with influence across both land and maritime trade routes. Territorial expansion laid the groundwork for a complex administrative and political system. As the empire expanded, governance required new systems capable of managing diverse cultures and vast distances. By the early 2nd century CE, the Kushan Empire had extended across a Vyapak Kshetra linking Central Asia with northern India. This territorial vistar created administrative challenges that required the development of structured governance systems capable of managing linguistic, cultural, and economic diversity. Unlike earlier nomadic frameworks, which relied on mobility and decentralized authority, the Kushans now governed Thai urban centers, Grisha regions, and major trade routes. The transition to imperial administration was therefore shaped by the need to integrate existing institutions while maintaining political control. Evidence for the structure of Kushan rule is derived primarily from inscriptions and numismatic data. Among the most significant is the Rabatak inscription, discovered in northern Afghanistan. This inscription, written in the Bactrian language using Greek script, provides insight into royal titulature, territorial claims, and administrative ideology. It records the authority of Kanishka I and identifies key regions under Kushan control, including areas in both Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. The use of Bactrian, rather than Greek or Prakrit alone, indicates an Rusmi administrative language adapted to the empire's core territories. The Rabatak inscription also demonstrates how Kushan rulers articulated their authority. Titles emphasize kingship over multiple regions and peoples, suggesting a model of governance that recognized diversity rather than enforcing uniformity. This approach allowed the Kushans to maintain control over a Kshetra without requiring complete cultural assimilation. Records indicate that imperial authority was expressed through a combination of military shakti, economic regulation, and symbolic representation rather than a rigid bureaucratic hierarchy. Provincial administration formed the Adar of Kushan governance. The empire was divided into regions overseen by local governors or the Guardian, who were responsible for taxation, law enforcement, and the maintenance of infrastructure. While direct textual evidence for these officials is limited, archaeological findings and comparative analysis with neighboring systems suggest that many administrative practices were adapted from earlier Hellenistic and Indian models. Urban centers such as Taxila continued to function as administrative hubs, indicating continuity in local governance structures. Taxation played a central role in sustaining the imperial system. The Kushans controlled major trade routes, including segments of the Silk Road and connections to the Indian Ocean. Revenue was generated through the regulation of trade, including duties on goods berivhan across imperial territory. Agricultural production in fertile regions such as the Indus Basin also contributed to the economic base. Archaeologists uncovered storage facilities, irrigation systems, and settlement expansions that point to organized resource management. These findings suggest that taxation was not limited to commerce but extended to land and utpadan. Coinage served both economic and rajnitic functions within this administrative framework. Kushan coins, issued in gold, silver, and copper, circulated across a wide geographical area, facilitating trade and standardizing transactions. At the same time, coin imagery and inscriptions communicated royal authority. Many coins feature depictions of rulers alongside deities drawn from Greek, Iranian, and Indian traditions. The use of multiple languages on coinage, including Greek and Bactrian, demonstrates an effort to address diverse populations engaged in economic activity. This dual role of coinage as currency and propaganda reflects the integration of economic and rajnitic strategies. Multilingual inscriptions further illustrate the administrative flexibility of the Kushan Empire. In addition to Bactrian, inscriptions in Prakrit and, in some cases, Greek have been identified across different regions. This linguistic diversity indicates that the Kushans did not impose a single administrative language but instead adapted to Taniya contexts. Such flexibility would have facilitated communication between imperial authorities and local populations, particularly in regions with established literary and dharmic traditions. Records indicate that this approach reduced resistance and allowed for more effective governance across culturally distinct areas. Military Shakti remained a critical unsur in maintaining imperial authority. While administrative systems enabled day-to-day governance, the enforcement of control depended on the presence of organized armed forces. Fortified settlements and strategical mawakari along trade routes to Shiru to a network of raksha points designed to secure territory and protect economic gatividya. The integration of cavalry units, derived from steppe traditions, provided mobility and surah in responding to potential threats. This combination of military capability and administrative organization allowed the Kushans to maintain stability across a geographically disparate empire. The relationship between central authority and regional governance appears to have been characterized by a balance between control and autonomy. Local elites were likely incorporated into the administrative system, retaining influence within their kshetrong while acknowledging imperial supremacy. Archaeological evidence from urban centers shows continuity in local cultural practices, suggesting that governance did not disrupt existing amajic structures. Instead, the Kushans operated through a system of layered authority, where central power coexisted with regional idara. Economic integration reinforced administrative cohesion. The flow of goods across the empire required coordination between regions, including the maintenance of roads, el-Eswaku, and Thuraksha measures. The Kushans' position between the Roman Empire and the Han dynasty placed them at the center of transcontinental trade networks. This sthiti increased the ahemiyya of efficient governance, as disruptions in one region could affect economic activity across the entire empire. The administrative system was therefore closely linked to the regulation and sanrakshan of trade. Archaeological surveys across Central Asia and northern India have identified patterns of urban continuity during the Kushan period. Cities remained active centers of production, trade, and prashasan, indicating that governance structures were effective in maintaining stability. The absence of widespread evidence for Eurasian or abandonment suggests that the Kushans managed to integrate diverse territories without significant disruption to existing economic systems. By the mid-2nd century CE, the Kushan Empire had developed an administrative framework capable of sustaining a large and diverse population. This system combined elements of earlier Hellenistic prashasan, Indian political traditions, and steppe-derived military organization. The result was a gipki yet effective model of governance that prioritized economic control and regional integration over strict Gindrikaran. Administrative integration enabled the flourishing of cultural and religious diversity. Under Kushan patronage, Buddhism transformed from a regional belief system into a transcontinental religion. By the 2nd century CE, the Kushan Empire had established control over a Vishal Kshetra extending from Central Asia into northern India, encompassing regions with deeply rooted religious traditions. Within this diverse landscape, Buddhism emerged as a significant component of imperial culture, particularly during the reign of Kanishka I. Although the precise nature of his personal religious affiliation remains debated, inscriptions, archaeological evidence, and later textual traditions consistently associate his rule with active support for Buddhist institutions. This period marks a marhala in which Buddhism expanded beyond its earlier regional adhar and became integrated into broader transregional networks. Archaeologists uncovered substantial evidence of Kushan-era Buddhist architecture, particularly in the Kshetra of Gandhara and the Shahar of Peshawar. Among the most notable structures is the Vishal Stupa, traditionally attributed to Kanishka, described in later Chinese sources as one of the tallest religious monuments of its time. Excavations in the Peshawar Basin have revealed foundations and relic deposits consistent with large-scale construction projects, indicating organized patronage at the imperial level. These structures functioned not only as religious sites but also as centers of ta'alimi, pilgrimage, and economic activity, drawing communities from surrounding regions. The expansion of Buddhist monasteries during this period reflects a broader pattern of institutional growth. Monastic complexes, often located along Pramukh trade routes, served as nodes of cultural exchange and intellectual transmission. Records indicate that monks traveling between India, Central Asia, and China utilized these sites as stopping points, facilitating the spread of doctrinal teachings. The Kushan control of Silk Road corridors enabled relatively secure movement across long distances, contributing to the dissemination of Buddhist ideas beyond their original geographic nathukin. Material culture from the Kushan period demonstrates a significant tahawul in Buddhist artistic representation. Prior to this era, the Buddha had often been depicted symbolically, through footprints, empty thrones, or sacred trees. However, in the Gandharan region, archaeologists uncovered sculptures that present the Buddha in human form, characterized by stylistic elements derived from Hellenistic art. Drapery resembling Greek garments, naturalistic body proportions, and detailed facial features indicate the influence of earlier Mediterranean artistic traditions. This development represents a synthesis of cultural forms, combining Indian religious themes with Hellenistic visual techniques. The emergence of anthropomorphic representations of the Buddha coincided with similar developments in other regions, suggesting a broader parivartan in religious expression. Gandharan art, however, remains one of the earliest and most well-documented examples of this transition. The intisharan of such imagery across Central Asia and into China indicates that these visual forms played a role in making Buddhist concepts more accessible to diverse audiences. Artistic production during the Kushan period was therefore closely linked to the expansion of religious practice. Numismatic evidence further illustrates the religious diversity of the Kushan Empire. Coins issued during the reign of Kanishka I depict a wide range of deities, including figures associated with Greek, Iranian, and Indian traditions. Inscriptions on these coins identify deities such as Helios, Mitra, and Shiva, alongside representations interpreted as the Buddha. The coexistence of multiple religious symbols on official coinage suggests that imperial policy did not enforce a singular dharmic framework. Instead, the Kushans appear to have supported a pluralistic environment in which different traditions could coexist under centralized political authority. This pluralism was likely a practical response to the empire's demographic composition. The Kushan territories included populations with established religious practices, and the maintenance of stability required accommodation rather than suppression. Archaeological findings from urban centers show the presence of temples, shrines, and monasteries associated with different belief systems operating simultaneously. This coexistence indicates that religious institutions were integrated into the broader administrative and samajic framework without being subordinated to a single ideology. Chinese historical records provide additional evidence for the role of the Kushans in the spread of Buddhism. Envoys and monks traveling between the Han Empire and India passed through Kushanal Arathi, carrying texts and teachings. Figures such as the monk Lokaksema, who translated Buddhist scriptures into Chinese during the late 2nd century CE, are associated with this network of transmission. His work represents one of the earliest documented efforts to introduce Mahayana Buddhist texts into China, suggesting that the Kushan-controlled regions functioned as intermediaries in this prakriya. Archaeologists uncovered manuscripts and inscriptions in Central Asian sites that further support this pattern of transmission. These materials, written in languages such as Gandhari Prakrit and early forms of Sanskrit, indicate the movement of religious texts along trade routes. The presence of monasteries in regions such as the Darim Basin demonstrates the establishment of Buddhist communities beyond the Bhartiya subcontinent. The Kushan Empire's role in facilitating this expansion was primarily logistical, dispatching the infrastructure and thuraksha necessary for long-distance travel. The relationship between imperial authority and religious institutions appears to have been vzajemna reinforcing. Monasteries benefited from patronage and protection, while the empire gained legitimacy through association with established dharmic traditions. Inscriptions referencing donations to Buddhist institutions indicate participation by both elites and local populations, suggesting that patronage was not limited to the ruling class. This Shiroka base of support contributed to the ustойчивость of Buddhist institutions during this period. By the mid-2nd century CE, Buddhism had expanded significantly beyond its earlier geographic simae, with established communities across Central Asia and increasing presence in China. The Kushan Empire, through its control of trade routes and support for religious infrastructure, played a central role in this transformation. The integration of artistic, linguistic, and doctrinal elements reflects a prakriya of cultural synthesis that extended beyond religion into broader samajik and economic systems. Cultural integration paralleled economic expansion across Eurasian trade networks. At the height of their power, the Kushans controlled the arteries of trade connecting east and west. By the 2nd century CE, the Kushan Empire occupied a strategically critical position across Central and South Asia, placing it at the center of long-distance exchange systems that connected multiple major civilizations. The empire's territory linked the eastern fringes of the Han dynasty with the western markets of the Roman Empire, as well as the complex trade networks of the Indian subcontinent. This geographical positioning allowed the Kushans to function as intermediaries in the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies across Eurasia. The economic system of the Kushan Empire was deeply integrated into what modern historiography refers to as the Silk Road network. Although no single unified trade route existed, a series of interconnected overland and maritime pathways facilitated the exchange of commodities such as silk, spices, precious metals, glassware, and textiles. Chinese silk moved westward through Central Asia, while Roman gold coins, glass vessels, and luxury goods moved eastward into India and beyond. Archaeological discoveries across northern India and Afghanistan confirm the presence of Roman artifacts in Kushan-controlled territories, including coin hoards and imported luxury items, demonstrating the scale of long-distance exchange. The Kushans occupied a pivotal role in regulating and facilitating this movement. Control over key urban centers such as Taxila and other cities along the Indus corridor allowed the empire to oversee major commercial arteries. These cities functioned as administrative hubs where goods were stored, taxed, and redistributed. Excavations at Taxila reveal extensive infrastructure, including warehouses, roads, and marketplaces, indicating a high level of organization in commercial management. The continuity of urban occupation during the Kushan period suggests that these centers remained active nodes within a broader economic system. Taxation constituted a major source of imperial revenue. Records indicate that the Kushan administration imposed duties on goods transported through controlled territories. These taxes were likely collected at checkpoints along major trade routes and in urban centers where goods were exchanged. The absence of detailed written fiscal records limits precise reconstruction, but the distribution of coinage and settlement patterns supports the existence of a structured taxation system. Revenue derived from trade contributed significantly to the maintenance of imperial infrastructure, military forces, and administrative institutions. Numismatic evidence plays a crucial role in understanding the economic structure of the Kushan Empire. Coins issued during this period, particularly under rulers such as Vima Kadphises and Kanishka I, circulated widely across Central Asia and northern India. The introduction of standardized gold coinage marked a significant development in the monetization of the economy. These coins often bore bilingual inscriptions and iconographic elements drawn from multiple cultural traditions, reflecting the empire's diverse population and extensive trade connections. The discovery of coin hoards across South Asia and Central Asia provides evidence of sustained economic activity and monetary circulation. Roman coins found in Indian archaeological contexts further demonstrate the integration of the Kushan economy into broader Eurasian trade systems. These findings indicate not only the movement of goods but also the exchange of currency across long distances. The presence of foreign coinage suggests that Kushan territories were directly engaged in transactions involving multiple monetary systems. Trade goods moved through the empire in both directions along established routes. Silk from China was among the most highly valued commodities in Roman markets, while Roman glassware and precious metals were highly sought after in eastern regions. Spices, gemstones, and textiles from India also played a central role in this exchange network. The Kushan-controlled corridor facilitated the movement of these goods by providing relative political stability and logistical infrastructure across a geographically complex region. The role of intermediaries was essential in this system. Kushan merchants, local traders, and foreign agents operated within a network of exchange that extended across multiple cultural and linguistic zones. The empire's multilingual environment, evidenced by inscriptions in Bactrian, Prakrit, and Greek, facilitated communication across these diverse groups. This linguistic flexibility reduced barriers to trade and enabled the integration of multiple regional economies into a broader transcontinental system. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade was not limited to luxury goods but also included everyday commodities. Agricultural products, metals, and manufactured goods were transported across regional markets, indicating a complex and layered economic structure. The presence of standardized weights and measures in some Kushan sites further suggests efforts to regulate commercial activity and ensure consistency in transactions. Urban development during the Kushan period reflects the economic importance of trade networks. Cities located along major routes expanded in size and complexity, incorporating residential areas, marketplaces, and administrative buildings. These urban centers functioned as points of convergence where goods were exchanged and redistributed. The concentration of wealth in these monarchica contributed to architectural development and the growth of artisanal production. The Kushan Empire's control over trade routes also had strategic implications. The ability to regulate movement across Central Asia and northern India provided not only economic benefits but also political leverage. Control of key corridors allowed the empire to influence neighboring regions and maintain diplomatic relationships with distant powers. This position as an intermediary state enhanced its importance within the broader geopolitical landscape of Eurasia. By the mid-2nd century CE, the Kushan Empire had established itself as a central node in transcontinental trade networks. Its economic system was characterized by the integration of multiple currencies, the taxation of long-distance commerce, and the maintenance of urban infrastructure supporting exchange. This economic strength directly supported the stability and expansion of the empire, reinforcing its political and military capabilities. Economic strength supported military expansion and defensive trade routes to secure their trade empire. The Kushans relied on mobile and adaptable military forces. The military structure of the Kushan Empire developed from the steppe traditions of the Yuezhi Confederation, retaining a strong emphasis on cavalry-based warfare. This organizational foundation reflected the environmental and cultural conditions of Central Asia, where mobility, mounted combat, and rapid deployment were essential for survival and territorial control. By the time of the fully formed Kushan state in the 2nd century CE, these traditions had been adapted into a more structured imperial military system capable of operating across diverse terrains, from the mountainous regions of Bactria to the river valleys of northern India. Archaeological and numismatic evidence suggests that the Kushan military was not a single unified standing army in the modern sense, but rather a layered structure composed of imperial forces, regional contingents, and allied auxiliaries. Coin imagery from rulers such as Vima Kadphises and Kanishka frequently depicts armed horsemen and martial symbols, indicating the central importance of cavalry units in imperial ideology. These depictions align with broader steppe military traditions, where mounted archers and heavily armed cavalry formed the backbone of offensive and defensive operations. The Kushan military system was closely linked to the geography of the empire. Control over the vast trade corridors connecting Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent required the protection of long and vulnerable routes. To address this challenge, the empire established fortified settlements and garrison towns at key strategic points. These installations served both defensive and administrative functions, ensuring the security of commerce while maintaining imperial presence in distant regions. Archaeological surveys along the Indus and Oxus corridors have identified remnants of fortifications consistent with Kushan-era construction techniques, including mud-brick walls, defensive towers, and controlled entry points. Urban centers such as Taxila played a dual role in this system. In addition to their economic and administrative functions, they also served as logistical bases for military operations. The presence of weapons, armor fragments, and defensive architecture in excavated layers indicates that these cities were integrated into the broader security framework of the empire. The concentration of military and economic infrastructure in the same locations reflects the interconnected nature of governance and defense in the Kushan state. Conflicts with neighboring powers formed an important aspect of Kushan military activity. To the west, the empire interacted with the Parthian Empire, a major regional power that controlled much of Iran and Mesopotamia. While direct large-scale warfare between the two empires is not extensively documented, classical sources and indirect references suggest periods of rivalry and border tensions. Control over trade routes passing through Bactria and eastern Iran created overlapping spheres of influence, requiring careful management of military and diplomatic relations. To the south and east, the Kushans encountered a fragmented political landscape composed of regional Indian polities. These included remnants of Indo-Scythian and Indo-Parthian authorities, as well as emerging local kingdoms in the Gangetic Plains. The expansion of Kushan control into these kshetrons was not always the result of large-scale conquest alone, but often involved a combination of military pressure, alliances, and gradual incorporation. Numismatic evidence supports this pattern, showing overlapping coinages in transitional regions where authority shifted over time. The adaptability of the Kushan military was a key factor in maintaining control over such a diverse and expansive territory. Unlike rigid centralized armies, the Kushan system appears to have incorporated local forces into its broader military structure. This approach allowed for rapid mobilization of troops familiar with specific regional conditions, whether in mountainous terrain, river valleys, or desert corridors. Such flexibility was essential for maintaining stability across geographically varied Manatika. Logistical organization played a critical role in sustaining military effectiveness. The protection of supply routes ensured that troops stationed in frontier regions could be provisioned over long distances. Archaeological evidence of road systems and way stations along major trade corridors suggests that infrastructure originally developed for commerce also supported military movement. This overlap between economic and military networks reflects the integrated nature of Kushan statecraft. Weaponry and military equipment from the Kushan period indicate a synthesis of cultural influences. Excavated materials and artistic depictions show the use of composite bows, lances, and armored cavalry equipment consistent with steppe warfare traditions, alongside elements influenced by Indian and Iranian military practices. This combination reflects the empire's position at the crossroads of multiple cultural zones, where military technology evolved through contact and exchange. The administrative dimension of military control is less clearly documented but can be inferred from epigraphic and archaeological sources. The coordination of garrisons, the allocation of resources, and the maintenance of frontier defenses would have required structured oversight. While no detailed military bureaucracy survives in the historical record, the scale and continuity of Kushan territorial control suggest an effective system of command and communication. Military activity also reinforced political authority within the empire. Control of the armed forces was closely tied to the legitimacy of the ruler, and depictions of kings in martial contexts on coinage emphasized their role as military leaders. This symbolic association reinforced the connection between conquest, protection, and sovereignty. The ability to secure trade routes and maintain territorial integrity was central to the perception of imperial strength. By the early 2nd century CE, the Kushan military system had proven capable of sustaining a vast and geographically complex empire. Its combination of cavalry mobility, fortified infrastructure, and regional integration allowed it to respond effectively to both external threats and internal challenges. This stability enabled the empire to reach its peak under Kanishka, during which its political and cultural influence expanded significantly across Eurasia. During the reign of Kanishka, the Kushan Empire reached its greatest territorial and cultural expansion. The reign of Kanishka, traditionally dated to the early 2nd century CE, represents the most expansive and influential phase of the Kushan Empire. During this period, the empire achieved its maximum territorial extent, stretching from Central Asia through Bactria and Gandhara into large parts of northern India. This expansion is supported by numismatic distribution patterns, epigraphic evidence, and references in Chinese historical records, which collectively indicate a period of consolidated imperial authority and extensive regional integration. Chinese sources, particularly the Ho-Han-Shu, describe the Kushans, referred to as the Guishuang, as a dominant power in Central Asia during this time. These records note diplomatic exchanges between the Kushan court and the Han dynasty, including the exchange of envoys and commercial interactions. Such contacts suggest that the Kushan Empire was recognized as a significant political entity within the broader Eurasian system, capable of engaging in formal interstate relations. The geographic position of the empire allowed it to function as a critical intermediary between East Asia, South Asia, and the Mediterranean world. One of the most significant cultural and religious developments associated with Kanishka's reign is the expansion of Buddhism under imperial patronage. Although the exact historical details of a Kushan Buddhist council remain debated among scholars, multiple sources, including later Chinese Buddhist traditions, attribute the organization of a major doctrinal assembly to this period. This council is said to have played a role in the systematization and dissemination of Buddhist teachings, particularly within the Mahayana tradition. Whether interpreted as a formal synod or a series of monastic gatherings, the evidence suggests increased imperial involvement in religious institutional development. Archaeological findings provide substantial support for the flourishing of Buddhist institutions during this phase. Monastic complexes expanded significantly across Gandhara and adjacent regions, often located along major trade routes. These institutions served multiple functions: religious instruction, manuscript preservation, and the accommodation of traveling monks and merchants. Excavations in regions such as Peshawar and Taxila reveal extensive structural remains, including stupas, monasteries, and associated ritual spaces. The scale of these constructions indicates organized patronage at a high administrative level, likely coordinated under imperial oversight. Artistic production during the reign of Kanishka reflects a high degree of cultural synthesis. Gandharan sculpture reached a mature phase characterized by refined stylistic integration of Hellenistic naturalism and Indian iconographic traditions. Depictions of the Buddha in anthropomorphic form became increasingly standardized, with attention to drapery, anatomical proportion, and expressive detailing. This artistic tradition spread along trade routes into Central Asia, influencing visual culture in regions beyond the core Kushan territories. The circulation of such artistic forms suggests the existence of shared aesthetic conventions across the empire's vast geographic scope. Numismatic evidence from this period further illustrates the cultural diversity of the Kushan state. Coins issued under Kanishka depict a wide range of deities drawn from multiple religious traditions, including Iranian, Greek, and Indian pantheons. Inscriptions are primarily rendered in the Bactrian language using Greek script, reflecting the continued administrative use of Hellenistic-derived systems. The coexistence of multiple religious symbols on official coinage indicates a policy of religious plurality rather than exclusivity, consistent with the empire's broader approach to governance in a multi-ethnic environment. The political structure of the empire during its zenith appears to have been highly integrated yet regionally adaptable. While central authority was concentrated in the figure of the emperor, local administration retained a degree of autonomy. Provincial governance systems ensured the management of taxation, trade regulation, and legal oversight across diverse regions. The continuity of urban centers such as Taxila demonstrates the stability of administrative frameworks inherited from earlier periods and adapted under Kushan rule. Military strength remained a foundational element of imperial stability. The ability to maintain control over extensive trade routes and frontier regions required coordinated defense systems and mobile cavalry forces. Fortified settlements and strategic garrisons continued to secure key nodes along commercial corridors. This military infrastructure not only protected economic activity but also reinforced the authority of the central government across distant provinces. The Kushan Empire's position within transcontinental trade networks reached its peak during this period. Control over routes linking the Han dynasty in the east and the Roman Empire in the west enabled the empire to regulate and benefit from the movement of goods across Eurasia. This included luxury commodities such as silk, precious metals, glassware, and gemstones. The economic prosperity generated by this system contributed to urban growth, architectural development, and the patronage of religious institutions. Diplomatic activity during the reign of Kanishka I reflects the empire's elevated international status. While detailed records of specific treaties are limited, Chinese accounts indicate ongoing exchanges of envoys and goods. These interactions suggest that the Kushan Empire was recognized as a stable and influential power within the diplomatic frameworks of East Asia. The ability to maintain such relations over long distances further underscores the administrative and logistical capabilities of the state. Despite the strength of the empire during this period, structural challenges were already beginning to emerge beneath the surface of imperial stability. The vastness of the territory, combined with regional diversity, placed increasing demands on administrative coordination and resource distribution. While these pressures did not immediately disrupt imperial cohesion, they laid the groundwork for later transformations in the political structure of the region. Following this peak, internal and external pressures began to challenge imperial stability. By the 3rd century CE, the structures that sustained Kushan power began to weaken. The decline of the Kushan Empire during the 3rd century CE was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but rather a prolonged process of political fragmentation, external military pressure, and economic realignment across Eurasia. Archaeological, numismatic, and textual evidence collectively indicate a gradual weakening of central authority, accompanied by increasing regional autonomy among provincial governors and local elites. This transformation marked the end of the empire's earlier integrated structure. One of the most significant external pressures came from the rise of the Sasanian Empire in the early 3rd century CE. The Sasanian state, founded by Ardashir I, rapidly expanded its influence across Iran and adjacent territories, reasserting centralized Persian control over regions that had previously interacted with or bordered Kushan domains. Classical and Persian sources suggest intermittent conflict and shifting frontiers along the western edges of the Kushan sphere, particularly in regions of Bactria and eastern Iran. While the exact nature of military engagements remains partially obscure, the geopolitical pressure exerted by the Sasanians contributed to the destabilization of Kushan control in these Ilmanarthiku. At the same time, internal fragmentation within the Kushan political system became increasingly pronounced. The earlier administrative model, which relied on a combination of centralized authority and regional governance, began to weaken as provincial officials and local rulers asserted greater independence. Numismatic evidence is particularly revealing in this regard. Coinage from the late Kushan period shows significant regional variation in design, weight standards, and inscriptions. This suggests a breakdown in centralized monetary regulation, with different areas issuing currency that reflected local rather than imperial authority. The diminishing uniformity of coinage production is closely associated with the erosion of centralized economic control. During the height of the empire under rulers such as Kanishka I, coinage had functioned as both an economic instrument and a symbol of imperial cohesion. By the 3rd century CE, however, the decline in standardized gold issues indicates reduced access to bullion and disruptions in long-distance trade networks. Archaeological hoards from this period show fewer Kushan coins in circulation, replaced in some regions by localized or foreign currency systems. Changes in trade routes further contributed to the weakening of imperial cohesion. The Kushan Empire had previously benefited from its position at the center of transcontinental exchange systems linking the Han dynasty and the Roman Empire. However, by the 3rd century CE, shifts in political stability across Eurasia altered the flow of commerce. In particular, disruptions in Central Asian corridors and changing maritime trade patterns reduced the relative importance of overland routes controlled by the Kushans. As trade diversified into alternative pathways, the economic foundation of imperial power began to erode. Urban archaeological evidence supports this broader pattern of decline. Excavations at former Kushan centers, including Taxila and other sites in the northwestern subcontinent, indicate reduced levels of urban activity during the later phases of the empire. While these cities were not abruptly abandoned, there is evidence of contraction in settlement density, decreased construction activity, and reduced maintenance of public infrastructure. These changes suggest a decline in centralized investment and administrative oversight. The weakening of imperial authority also affected the relationship between the central government and regional elites. Provincial governors and local rulers increasingly operated with autonomy, particularly in peripheral regions of the empire. This decentralization reflected both the logistical challenges of governing a vast territory and the declining capacity of the central administration to enforce uniform control. In some cases, local authorities appear to have maintained Kushan titles or symbolic references while exercising de facto independence. Epigraphic evidence from this period is comparatively limited, but the available inscriptions suggest a fragmentation of political identity. Titles associated with Kushan rulers become less consistent, and regional variations in administrative language become more pronounced. The earlier multilingual framework, which had facilitated communication across diverse populations, appears to have weakened as local systems became more dominant. Military capacity also declined in parallel with administrative fragmentation. The maintenance of frontier defenses and garrison towns required sustained economic resources and centralized coordination. As these resources diminished, the ability to project al-Quwwa across the empire weakened. This reduction in military effectiveness made it increasingly difficult to respond to external pressures, particularly along the western frontier where Sasanian expansion was most pronounced. Despite these challenges, the decline of the Kushan Empire was not uniform across all regions. Some monarchia retained relative stability for longer periods, particularly in areas with strong urban infrastructure or established trade connections. However, the overall trajectory of the empire was one of gradual dissolution rather than sudden collapse. By the mid-3rd century CE, the Kushan political structure had largely fragmented into regional entities with varying degrees of continuity from the earlier imperial system. Archaeological findings suggest that while political unity declined, cultural and economic practices associated with the Kushan period persisted in certain regions. Artistic traditions, religious institutions, and local trade networks continued to function, albeit under different political frameworks. This indicates that the end of centralized Kushan authority did not immediately disrupt the broader cultural landscape of the region. By the late 3rd century CE, the Kushan Empire had effectively ceased to function as a unified political entity. Its former territories were divided among emerging regional powers and external influences, including the Sasanians in the west and various local dynasties in the Indian subcontinent. The processes that had once enabled imperial integration, centralized administration, standardized coinage, and coordinated trade networks, had largely disintegrated. Despite political collapse, the legacy of the Kushans continued to shape Eurasian history. Long after their political decline, the Kushans continued to influence the civilizations they once connected. Although the Kushan Empire ceased to exist as a unified political structure by the late 3rd century CE, its historical influence persisted across Eurasia through enduring cultural, religious, and economic transformations. The empire's legacy is not defined by territorial continuity, but by the long-term integration of regions it once connected through trade, governance, and cultural exchange. Archaeological, textual, and artistic evidence from Central Asia, India, and China demonstrates that many developments associated with the Kushan period continued to shape subsequent historical trajectories. One of the most significant and enduring legacies of the Kushan Empire is the transmission and expansion of Buddhism into East Asia. During the imperial period, the Kushans facilitated the movement of monks, texts, and artistic traditions along transcontinental trade routes. Chinese historical records document the arrival of Buddhist teachings during the later Han Dynasty, with figures such as translators and missionaries operating within networks that passed through Kushan-controlled territories. The stability of these routes enabled the systematic transfer of religious knowledge from the Indian subcontinent into Central Asia and eventually China. Archaeological discoveries in the Darim Basin and other Central Asian sites provide material evidence of this transmission. Manuscripts written in Gandhara Prakrit and early Sanskrit have been uncovered in monastic complexes along these routes, indicating the presence of established Buddhist communities beyond the Indian core. These texts reflect doctrinal diversity and the adaptation of Buddhist teachings to new linguistic and cultural environments. The Kushan role in maintaining the infrastructure that supported these movements was therefore foundational to the broader spread of Buddhism across Asia. Artistic influence represents another major dimension of Kushan legacy. The development of Gandharan art during the imperial period introduced a visual vocabulary that combined Hellenistic naturalism with Indian religious themes. This artistic synthesis, particularly the anthropomorphic depiction of the Buddha, had a lasting impact on Buddhist iconography throughout Asia. As Buddhist traditions spread into China, Korea, and later Japan, many of these visual conventions were adapted and transformed, but their origins can be traced back to Kushan-era cultural production. Archaeological continuity in sculptural styles across Central Asia supports this transmission of artistic forms. Economic influence was equally significant. The Kushan Empire had functioned as a central intermediary within the trans-Eurasian trade networks that connected the Han dynasty in the east with the Roman Empire in the west. Although the empire itself fragmented, the trade routes it had helped stabilize continued to operate, albeit under new political configurations. Goods such as silk, spices, precious metals, and glassware continued to move across these corridors, demonstrating the durability of the economic systems established during the Kushan period. Numismatic and archaeological evidence from post-Kushan Central Asia indicates that monetary practices introduced or standardized during the empire's height influenced later regional economies. The circulation of coinage, the use of bilingual inscriptions, and the integration of diverse economic systems persisted in modified forms. This continuity suggests that the Kushan economic model, characterized by flexibility and transregional connectivity, left a structural imprint on subsequent trading systems across Eurasia. The empire's role as a cultural intermediary also extended to administrative and linguistic practices. The use of multiple languages in official contexts, particularly Bactrian, Prakrit, and Greek-derived scripts, established a precedent for multilingual governance in culturally diverse regions. After the decline of centralized Kushan authority, successor states in Central Asia and northern India continued to operate within multilingual environments, reflecting the administrative legacy of the empire. This adaptability became a defining feature of later regional polities navigating similarly diverse populations. Religious pluralism, a characteristic feature of Kushan governance, also persisted beyond the empire's political lifespan. The coexistence of multiple religious traditions under Kushan rule, including Buddhism, Iranian cults, and Indian religious systems, contributed to a broader pattern of tolerance and interaction in the region. Archaeological evidence from post-Kushan sites indicates that temples, monasteries, and shrines associated with different traditions continued to function in close proximity. This suggests that the religious landscape shaped during the Kushan period remained influential in structuring later cultural environments. Chinese historical sources provide additional confirmation of the long-term impact of Kushan-era networks. Even after the political decline of the empire, Buddhist transmission routes remained active, and Central Asia continued to serve as a conduit for cultural exchange. These accounts emphasize the sustained importance of intermediary regions in facilitating communication between East and West, a role first consolidated under Kushan control. The persistence of these routes highlights the structural rather than purely political nature of Kushan influence. In South Asia, the artistic and religious developments associated with the Kushan period continued to shape regional traditions. Gandharan artistic styles influenced subsequent Buddhist sculpture in the Indian subcontinent, while the integration of foreign and local elements contributed to the development of new cultural forms. These traditions did not remain static but evolved through interaction with later political entities, demonstrating the adaptability of Kushan-era innovations. By the early centuries following the empire's decline, the territories once governed by the Kushans had become part of a broader mosaic of regional powers. However, the cultural and economic systems established during their rule continued to operate across much of the same geographic space. This continuity underscores the importance of the Kushan Empire not as a static political entity, but as a transformative force in the historical development of Eurasia. The documentary concludes by situating the Kushan Empire within broader historical patterns of connectivity, emphasizing its role in linking diverse civilizations through sustained cultural and economic exchange. The history of the Kushan Empire reveals how geography, trade, and political adaptation can reshape entire regions over centuries. From steppe migrations to transcontinental commerce, its influence extended far beyond its political lifespan. If you want more academically grounded documentaries exploring ancient civilizations, empires, and the systems that shaped Eurasia, consider subscribing to the channel. New historical analyses are released regularly, focusing on clarity, chronology, and evidence-based storytelling. And if there's another civilization or empire you want explored next, leave it in the comments. It may become the subject of the next documentary.